The dark side of Vietnam. Vietnam, like many countries, has a complex history that includes both positive and negative aspects. When discussing the darker aspects of Vietnam, several significant points are often highlighted. Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a pivotal and tragic period in Vietnamese history, marked by extensive suffering and lasting repercussions. Here are some of the darker aspects related to the Vietnam War. Massive loss of life. The war resulted in an enormous loss of life, with estimates of millions of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians killed. The conflict caused immeasurable human suffering, including deaths from combat, bombings, and the use of chemical weapons. Agent Orange and chemical warfare. The United States military used chemical defoliants like Agent Orange to destroy vegetation, leading to devastating consequences for human health and the environment. The chemical exposure caused severe health issues, birth defects, and ongoing environmental damage that continues to affect Vietnamese people, even generations later. Civilian casualties and displacement. Civilians suffered immensely during the war, facing displacement, bombings, and hardship. Villages and communities were destroyed, and many civilians were caught in the crossfire between opposing forces, leading to countless deaths and widespread displacement. Impact on infrastructure and economy. The war devastated Vietnam's infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, roads, and agricultural lands. The economic toll was significant, impeding the country's development for years after the war ended. Legacy of division and trauma. The war left a deep-seated impact on Vietnamese society, fostering division and trauma among its people. Families were torn apart, and the scars of the conflict persist in the collective memory of the nation. Long-term effects on veterans. Both Vietnamese veterans and American veterans who fought in the war continue to suffer from physical and mental health issues as a result of their wartime experiences. Many struggle with disabilities, trauma, and the long-term effects of exposure to various hazards. The Vietnam War profoundly shaped the country's history, leaving a legacy of pain, loss, and enduring challenges. Despite the passage of time, its effects continue to impact individuals and communities in Vietnam, underscoring the importance of remembering this dark chapter in history and striving for peace and reconciliation. Agent Orange and chemical warfare. The use of Agent Orange and other herbicides during the Vietnam War is one of the most tragic and enduring legacies of that conflict. Agent Orange was a chemical herbicide used by the U.S. military as part of its herbicidal warfare program, primarily aimed at destroying foliage and crops in Vietnam. Here are some key points regarding Agent Orange and its impact. Health effects. Agent Orange contained dioxin, a highly toxic chemical compound. Exposure to this herbicide has led to severe health issues among those affected, including Vietnamese civilians, U.S. military personnel, and their descendants. Health problems include various cancers, birth defects, neurological disorders, and other chronic illnesses. The effects continue to afflict not only those who were directly exposed, but also their children and grandchildren, passing on health issues through genetic inheritance. Environmental damage. The widespread use of Agent Orange and other herbicides had devastating consequences for the environment in Vietnam. It resulted in the destruction of forests, contamination of soil and water sources, and disruption of ecosystems. Decades later, areas sprayed with Agent Orange remain contaminated, posing ongoing risks to the health of local populations and wildlife. Humanitarian crisis. The use of Agent Orange caused a humanitarian crisis in Vietnam, leading to a significant number of birth defects and disabilities among children born to parents who were exposed to the chemical. Many families continue to struggle with caring for children with severe disabilities and health conditions linked to Agent Orange exposure. Legal and moral repercussions. Efforts have been made to address the consequences of Agent Orange. Legal battles have taken place in attempts to hold the manufacturers of Agent Orange accountable for the damages caused. There have also been initiatives to provide support and medical assistance to affected individuals and communities, although challenges persist in addressing the full scope of the issue. The devastating impact of Agent Orange serves as a stark reminder of the long-term consequences of chemical warfare and the need for ongoing support and efforts to mitigate its effects on affected populations in Vietnam and beyond. Human rights concerns. Vietnam has faced criticism and concerns regarding its human rights situation. Several issues have been highlighted by international organizations and human rights advocates. Freedom of expression and press. There are restrictions on freedom of expression and press in Vietnam. Independent journalists, bloggers, and activists face harassment, intimidation, and imprisonment for expressing dissenting opinions or criticizing the government. The government controls media outlets, and censorship is prevalent. Political dissent and imprisonment. Vietnam has a history of arresting and imprisoning individuals who speak out against the government or advocate for political reform. Dissidents, human rights defenders, and activists are often targeted, facing charges such as conducting propaganda against the state or attempting to overthrow the government. Restrictions on political participation. The Communist Party of Vietnam maintains a monopoly on political power, limiting the ability of opposition parties or independent candidates to participate in the political process. Political pluralism is restricted, and individuals who seek to establish independent political parties face repression. Suppression of religious freedom. While the Vietnamese government officially recognizes certain religions, religious groups not sanctioned by the state often face harassment, surveillance, and restrictions on practicing their faith. Religious leaders and followers have been subjected to intimidation, detention, or house arrest. Treatment of ethnic minorities. Ethnic minority groups, such as the Montagnards and Hmong, have faced discrimination and marginalization. There have been reports of land confiscation, forced evictions, and restrictions on cultural and linguistic rights for these minority communities. Efforts by the Vietnamese government to improve its human rights situation have been observed, such as the release of some political prisoners and engagement with international human rights mechanisms. However, substantial concerns persist regarding the protection of fundamental freedoms and human rights for all citizens in Vietnam. International human rights organizations continue to call for reforms and improvements in Vietnam's human rights record. Environmental challenges. Vietnam faces various environmental challenges that pose significant risks to public health, natural ecosystems, and the country's overall sustainability. Some of the key environmental issues include air and water pollution. Rapid industrialization, urbanization, and inadequate waste management systems have led to severe air and water pollution in many parts of Vietnam. Industrial emissions, vehicle exhaust, and agricultural runoff contribute to poor air quality and water contamination, affecting both human health and ecosystems. Deforestation and habitat loss. Vietnam has experienced extensive deforestation due to logging, agricultural expansion, and infrastructure development. This loss of forests and natural habitats has had detrimental effects on biodiversity, soil erosion, and the stability of ecosystems. Water scarcity and quality. Vietnam faces challenges related to water scarcity, particularly in dry seasons and in certain regions. Additionally, water quality is a concern due to pollution from industrial discharges, untreated sewage, and agricultural runoff, affecting both surface water and groundwater sources. Climate change vulnerability. Vietnam is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, including rising sea levels, increased frequency of extreme weather events like typhoons and floods, and changes in precipitation patterns. These phenomena threaten coastal communities, agricultural productivity, and infrastructure, leading to economic and social disruptions. Loss of biodiversity, habitat destruction, illegal wildlife trade, and environmental degradation have contributed to the loss of biodiversity in Vietnam. Many species, including endangered ones like tigers, elephants, and various endemic plants, face threats to their survival. Efforts to address these environmental challenges are being made through policy initiatives, conservation programs, and international cooperation. The government has taken steps to promote sustainable development, conservation of natural resources, and the adoption of renewable energy sources to mitigate the impacts of environmental degradation. However, significant challenges persist, and continued efforts are necessary to ensure a healthier and more sustainable environment for Vietnam and its people. Corruption and economic disparities. Corruption and economic disparities are significant challenges that Vietnam faces, impacting various aspects of society and development. Here's an overview of these issues. Corruption. Corruption remains a pervasive problem in Vietnam, affecting government institutions, business operations, and various sectors of society. Instances of bribery, embezzlement, nepotism, and other forms of corruption have been reported at different levels of the government and in public services. Corruption undermines transparency, erodes public trust in institutions, and hampers fair competition in the business environment. Economic disparities. Despite Vietnam's impressive economic growth and progress in poverty reduction, there are considerable disparities between different segments of the population and regions. Rural areas, ethnic minorities, and certain disadvantaged groups often experience lower standards of living, limited access to quality education, healthcare, and infrastructure compared to urban areas. Unequal distribution of wealth. The benefits of economic growth have not always been evenly distributed across society. Disparities in income and wealth exist, with a wealth gap between the rich and poor widening in some cases. Urban centers, particularly Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, have seen significant economic growth, while rural areas lag behind in development. Challenges in governance and transparency. Improving governance and transparency are ongoing challenges in Vietnam. Efforts to tackle corruption and ensure greater accountability in public institutions continue to be a work in progress. The Vietnamese government has implemented measures to address corruption and bridge economic disparities. Anti-corruption campaigns, legal reforms, and initiatives to enhance transparency and accountability in governance have been introduced. Additionally, policies focused on rural development, poverty alleviation, and social welfare programs aim to reduce economic inequalities and improve living conditions in disadvantaged areas. Continued efforts to strengthen institutions, promote transparency, and ensure equitable economic opportunities for all citizens are crucial to addressing these challenges and fostering a more inclusive and sustainable development in Vietnam. Despite these challenges, Vietnam has also made strides in its development, experiencing economic growth, improving living standards for many citizens, and making efforts to address some of these darker issues. The country continues to evolve, and there are ongoing efforts to tackle these challenges and promote progress while learning from the past.